Welcome to DBC. Today we are beginning with a new book, which is Boundaries. When to Say Yes, How to Say No to Take Control of Your Life. It's written by Henry Cloud and John Townsend. Before we begin, we're just going to hit the first bit real quick today, but I want to talk about this book, and there's a whole series of them, Boundaries in relationships, Boundaries in marriage, Boundaries at work, Boundaries in dating. Has a great marketing, as you can see, a cool cover, and great SEO on Amazon. But I got to tell you that one thing you might not notice, which I didn't notice, is that it's a Christian book. The authors in the first two chapters explicitly state that they seek to outline, define, and discuss boundaries with biblical justification, which they do, and it kind of varies based on chapter how much they go. Whether you're Christian or not, I still think there's a lot of good content in here, even if you're not a Christian. If you are, obviously it's right for you. If not, I've chosen to continue with the book because there's a lot of good insights in here. There are three parts to the book, three huge sections, which are what are boundaries, boundary conflicts, and then developing healthy boundaries. Today, we're only going to talk about the first half of the first one. So what are boundaries? Kind of working on a working definition of boundaries. We're going to look at specifically today, what is a boundary? What does it look like? And we're going to break down the main boundary problems that people, including ourselves, may have. To begin, what is a boundary? The authors don't give a dictionary definition of boundary, noun, but they give several examples and metaphors for us that we can think about and work with. And the first metaphor they give is of a homeowner and the idea of real estate having property lines. And so just as homeowners have physical property lines for their property, we need to set mental, physical, emotional, and spiritual boundaries for our lives to help distinguish what is our responsibility and what is not our responsibility. And so a couple of things in chapter 2 they talk about. So there's a couple of, not dictionary definitions, but examples. So the boundary shows me where I am, where I end and where somebody else begins. Boundaries help us keep the good things in and the bad things out. Back to kind of maybe physical property line. Boundaries are anything that help differentiate me from somebody else. And there's several ways we can do that. So for example, skin is a physical boundary between the body and the rest of the world. Words, they say that no is the most important boundary word in the English language. Geographical distance can be a boundary, emotional distance, other people and consequences. And one thing to sort of build on the metaphor of property lines, it's better to think of them as fences, they say. So fences need gates in them, right? Like fences aren't just a fence forever, but they have gates so things can get through. And that boundaries are not walls, but gates. So again, think of a gate, not a wall. Property lines should be permeable to allow people to pass through, or else no one could ever visit your house, right? So permeable, but also strong enough to keep danger out. And a note they make psychologically is that victims of physical and sexual abuse often have a poor sense of boundaries because early in life, they were taught and they learned through what happened to them that their property didn't really begin at their skin, and this carries on throughout their life. So the next question is, what falls within our boundaries, or what is our responsibility? And there's several things. I want just a couple here. So the first one is feelings. Our feelings are our responsibility. And the authors state wisely that feelings should not be ignored or placed in charge, but dealt with or worked with. They are our responsibility, and we must own them. Same thing with our attitudes and our beliefs. People with boundary problems usually have a distorted attitude about responsibility for these things. Also, our behaviors are our responsibility within our boundaries. And this idea towards other people, like if we rescue people from the natural consequences of their behavior, we render them powerless. And then kind of a tie-in to nonviolent communication, the last book we covered, our choices also fall within our boundaries. And they mentioned this linguistically, things to avoid saying, like, I had to do X, or I have to do Y, or she made me do this thing, or whatever. One last thing for boundaries, one other type. Setting limits. So limits is a huge thing here. Setting limits on others. We can't do that, actually. What we can do is we can set limits on our exposure to people who are behaving, they say poorly, but I say people that are behaving in a certain way. So we set standards. And then setting our own internal limits as well for ourselves. So we can't set limits on other actions. We can only set limits on who we choose to hang out with and spend time with. Okay, hopefully that gives you kind of a good idea. Think of boundaries as like these fences where things can come in and out, and they're not walls. Chapter 3 is, which is our last chapter we're going to cover today, is boundary problems. So there are different ways that boundaries can be non-functional or not function how they should. The first one is the type of person who is a compliant coming from the word compliance. And this is somebody who says yes to bad things. They melt into the demands and the needs of other people just to get along. They cannot say no. If you think of one thing, a compliant cannot say no. They always say yes or nothing and just comply complicitly. So they're like chameleons, and this type of boundary problem, it paralyzes their no muscles. And again, we talk about no as the most important boundary word, and the reason why can be varied. They can have a fear of hurting other people, punishment, being ostracized, shame, not being good enough. So that's someone who can't say no. And then the second type is an avoidant, someone who avoids things. So they say no to the good things, actually. And they have an inability to ask for help. They recognize one's own needs they can't recognize their own needs and let others in. And their boundaries are more walls than fences. That's sort of the problem there. So whereas the compliant couldn't say no, the avoidant cannot say yes. And then so with that, there's kind of a hybrid, and that is compliant avoidant, which is like if we combine these two people, it's like they have a reversed boundary. So they say yes to things they should say no to, and then no when they should say yes. And in relationships, they seek somebody to repair as an object, so unconsciously of their relationships, right? So we have compliance and avoidance. Can't say no, can't say yes. Two more types. There's a controller and a non-responsive. Controller, they have problems hearing and accepting other people's boundaries. So they can't hear the word no. Whereas the compliant can't say no, the controller does not hear no. No is simply a challenge to change the other person's mind, and because of that, they're frequently perceived as bullies, being manipulative and aggressive. And they tend to project responsibility for their lives onto other people. Two types of controllers, so people who can't hear no, there are people who are aggressive with it and manipulative. So aggressive is the person that just comes out and is like, this is my needs, right? And the manipulative one is more like pro quid quo, like they'll give gifts and give things, and then they will use them via guilt to hang over someone's head to get their way. Type 4 boundary problem is a non-responsive. And this is someone who is like a lack of attention to other people's needs. And this can be for two reasons. So type 1, this gets deeper a little bit. So they are critical towards other people's needs, as in like they think that they're not really needs, because they hate their own needs and they project that hatred onto other people, which is like, wow, pretty. And then so the second type of non-responsive are those who are so absorbed in their own desires and needs that they exclude others. And they give an example of a marriage relationship where there's a husband who's just too busy doing his own thing and this can go either way, right? He doesn't acknowledge his own needs, or he thinks his own needs are weak. So he implies that same weakness onto his wife, or he's just so absorbed that he doesn't even recognize it. So just like before there was a compliant avoidant, there's also with controllers and non-responsives, a controlling non-responsive. And they see that other people are responsible for their struggles, and they are on the lookout for someone to take care of them. And crazy, so a compliant avoidant with the reverse boundaries and a controlling non-responsive, they frequently like meet up and get married. So like what happens when they meet? They get married is the joke. One final distinction, and we're done today. There are two types of boundaries, again, a functional and a relational boundary. A functional boundary is someone's ability to complete a task, project, or job, or not. And a relational boundary is a person's ability to speak truth to the other people that they're in a relationship with. That's all we have for today. So we talked about boundaries. Think of this metaphor of property lines and fences as opposed to walls. So fences have gates and they are not walls. They are permeable, but there's a sense of control there. And then we talked about compliance, who cannot say no, an avoidant who cannot say yes, a controller who cannot hear no, and then a non-responsive who's just like checked out. Next time we're going to continue with the first section, and we're going to get deep. We're going to look at how boundaries are developed. Why do some people have like naturally healthy boundaries and others really struggle with these problems that we talked about today? And the hint is that it has a lot to do with the family that you're living in. Thank you for watching. We continue next time with boundaries.